Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of the Property Doctor podcast with me, your host, Dr. Andrew Threadgold. This week, it's a solo episode with little old me. I thought we'd talk a little bit about seller finance. I thought a real life example might be useful, actually. So, what I thought we'd do is I'll give you a little update on what's been happening, where we're up to, and then it links in nicely to seller finance, what it is, and how it's very common in business, but it's also applicable to property, so you could use it in both instances, actually. So where are we up to? Well, regular followers of the podcast will know that I'm documenting my journey, if you like, for want of a better word, to acquiring businesses to build a group. And I'm doing that on the various channels via the podcast. There's kind of accountability, really, and to help anybody else that might want to follow a similar path. So the point of this, by the way, is it's not related to property. It's a separate thing. It's distinct, and it's about my philosophy regarding multiple streams of income. So the property side is over here doing its thing, and then I'm trying to buy businesses and clump them together into a group. And the point being that these businesses will also produce income. And it's about multiple streams of income, basically. I mean, if there are synergies between the property stuff and businesses that I buy and they can link into each other, then that's great. You know, lots of businesses do complement each other, such as, you know, if you run holiday lets and you buy cleaning firms, it's perfect. That's a great little kind of synergy. But that's where it's coming from. So what have I been up to, and where are we at? Well, I think over the past kind of few months, I've contacted about 3,000 or so business owners via various means, whether that's by networking or through social media or by sending them letters or whatever. And out of those 3,000 or so, I must have had several dozen phone calls. And once you've done the phone calls for a little while, they kind of all kind of fall into a similar format, and you end up getting, you know, building rapport, and you know, because I'm genuinely interested in. I find the things that people have put themselves through to get to where they are absolutely fascinating. So I want to speak to these business owners and hear about their business and learn what they've done and how they've achieved what they've achieved and why they need to sell. And a lot of people have either had enough, or inflation's taking its toll, or wage rises, or they can't find the right staff, or they've got ill health, or whatever it is. There's millions of reasons why people want to exit their business. And there's not really that many people compared to a property where there's hundreds of thousands of property people out there. There's very few relatively business people that are willing to take the plunge and buy a business, but you know, I'm obviously one of them. So once I've spoken to them, quite a lot of the time, these businesses aren't right for me. When I talk about a business, I'm looking at something that's got really between £500,000 and £5 million worth of income as a business, and once you start getting to kind of £1 million, you start then having levels of management in an organisation. So quite a few, the vast majority of the conversations I've had have been with business owners where if they left, that business would no longer operate. And that's not a business, that's a job. Now, I don't need a job. I've got plenty of jobs to do, and plenty of other stuff to be getting on with, so I don't need to buy somebody else's job. And I've no doubt I couldn't run it in the way that person has done it if I had to replace them. So what I want to do is I want a business which runs even without the owner. So there's managers in there that run the business, and then I want to be the investor in the business and own it, and I will then lead the strategy and grow the business through my network and my ideas and all the rest of it, my philosophies, and in putting my cultural values into it. and then acquiring other businesses to grow that way. So that's the way that I'm looking at things. I don't want to buy somebody else's job. So a majority of the businesses that I've been in touch with fall into that category. Now, there's been a few that have been very suitable. Unfortunately, one of them is kind of at heads of terms at the minute. We're just negotiating the final points on that. So I'm hoping that kind of, once you get to heads of terms, then you kind of go into the legal process. It's dragging on a bit, if I'm honest with you. It's probably more a reflection on me, not driving it. Maybe it's also a reflection on the owners kind of unsure about selling. So that one will come on, we'll kind of update on that once it's gone one way or the other, because I can't really talk too much about it at the moment. Another two that I was convinced were perfect fell over, and it just so happens that the two that fell over, I'm going to talk about one of them shortly, the two that fell over were both for sale through business brokers. So you've heard me talk about business brokerages before, and I think I've learned a lesson here with these guys, because the facts are that only 1 in 20 businesses that's for sale through a business broker actually sells. They're much more motivated to get the listing because they get paid to list the business than they are to actually sell it. So in order to get the listing, they inflate ideas. So they might say that a business that makes £20,000 a year in net profit might be worth £500,000, and they'll convince the seller that that's what they'll get for it. The seller will sign up and pay them £20,000 to list the business, or whatever it is, making numbers up, but this is kind of the philosophy. And then once they've got their £20,000, they've got the little bonus from it, they'll move on to the next. And there'll be no effort at all to sell the business. But then when somebody approaches the seller and tries to buy the business, the seller has then got an inflated idea of what that business might be worth. And then they don't like it when a more realistic value comes in. Now, don't get me wrong, there is absolutely nothing wrong with somebody wanting as much as they can get for their business. That is not, I'm not trying to pull anybody's pants down with what I'm doing. But the market dictates what something is worth. It's just like when you sell your house. You may think it's worth 150 grand, but actually when everybody comes round, they might tell you it's actually only 120. And you can either stick with your listing at 150 or take the 120 and understand that the market's moved and that's what it is. And there's something called the endowment effect, where if you own something, so if you own an object, it's more valuable to you than it is to somebody else. And that's just human nature, and that's called the endowment effect. And, can you imagine if you've built a business from scratch, you've got it to a position, you've done 30 years in it, and you want to sell it? Imagine how much you would value that business. And that's perfectly understandable. But equally, the business brokers play on that to inflate the expectations to get the listings. So both of the two that fell over that I was really hopeful of, both were with brokers. And I think the lesson that I've learned there is that I will never deal with brokers ever again. Well, certainly not whilst I get the first one over the line, because there was so much time wasted and so much mental energy that went into it for it to unravel at the end due to probably unrealistic expectations that it's not worth it. There might be an exception there if you kind of get to kind of businesses that have been for sale for over a year or something like that, then maybe it might be worth it because there might be a little bit more motivation there. But the vast majority of businesses that are for sale with brokers, I think the standard terms is something like a 2 or a 3 year contract that they're tied into. And if only 1 in 20 sell, the vast majority of businesses have been for sale for longer than that. It is what it is, but it's a lesson that I've learned quite the hard way there. Anyway, so let's talk about one of these businesses that I had some high hopes for. Now, we'll talk broad numbers because it's confidential, and there won't be any identifying information given here. And bearing in mind that the deals that fell over, when I've spoken to people that have done business buying or deal making before and have done lots of it, and I've explained to them these are the terms I offered the seller, these guys have said to me, well, you were offering too much in the first place. You're clearly trying to get your first one over the line, that you're pushing too hard. And these kind of offers, whilst you would have, it's a good deal, you were probably paying more than other people would have. So that was quite an interesting thing too. Anyway, I digress. So the one that I wanted to talk about today was an energy brokerage. Now, I didn't really kind of have an energy brokerage in my sights at the time. When I was looking for, in the energy sector, I was more looking for things like solar panel manufacturers or electrical installers. But the data, when you try and approach businesses, the data is not perfect, and you end up getting things that may or may not suit you. Anyway, this one turned out to be quite good. So an energy brokerage is where they have a relationship with an energy provider such as British Gas. British Gas agrees to offer them a very low or a lower than the market rate for energy. They then sell you that energy. The brokerage then sells you that energy and makes a small commission on top, so that every unit of energy you use, the energy broker, gets a percentage of that. And this particular business was, I think their total turnover was about 600,000 to 700,000. So that means that the total income revenue that business brought in sales was about 600 to 700 grand. Then out of that, you've got then to pay your staff and your own energy and the lights and paper and all the rest of it, and whittle it down, all the wages, rent, etc., etc. And then at the end, you're left with what's called the net profit. So after all costs, the net profit for the owner of this business was about 90 to 100,000 pounds. The beauty of this business was that all the selling of the energy was done by other people, by agents, if you like, sales agents that ring up companies, because it was like a commercial energy thing. It wasn't residential. So they'd ring up pubs and, supermarkets or whatever and try and sell them gas and electric. And that was done by everybody else. So the owner really, whilst he was still involved and directing things, he wasn't critical to the operation of the thing, which is exactly what I was looking for. So I went away and did my sums, and I came back and I said to the guy, well, look, you're making around about 90 to 100 grand net profit. The average total sale value for businesses under the £5 million turnover level is around about between 1.5 to 2.5 times profit. There or thereabouts. So I said, well, why don't we think of something where the total value is around about 350,000, which is that's 3 times. So I'd gone past the 2.5, and I was even looking at more than 3 times profit as a total value. And then we tried to figure out how we could make it work. So I tried to get to see how I could finance the deal. And because of the war in Ukraine, because of the change in gas and electricity prices recently, because businesses weren't buying contracts, they weren't contracting to a specific price, they were just kind of floating at that floating rate. Nobody wanted to finance. So the banks and the finance brokers, nobody wanted to say that they would finance the deal. And if you can't finance it, you can't buy it. Because ultimately, 90% of all businesses are bought with some sort of finance. The days of turning up, as Jonathan Jay says, the days of turning up in your Rolls Royce and writing a gold cheque and the business owner sailing off into the sunset with all their money, that died in the 80s. Nowadays, everything's financed and it's done in staged payments. So when I said to the guy, look, I can get you 100 grand on day one, and then the rest of it we will have to stage over various, over a period of time that is negotiable. And he wasn't happy. He couldn't see that was worth it to him, because he'd been told that his business was worth much more than that. In actual fact, there was a reference that in the past, 5 or 6 years ago, when the world was a very different place before COVID, somebody had offered him a total package of about 700,000 or 800,000. Well, that was a different time, and unfortunately, things are the way they are. We can't buy a business on its past performance; we can only on its current dealings. So he wasn't happy. Cut a long story short, and he wasn't interested in seller finance of any sort. He was not interested in stage payments. He wasn't interested. I even offered him like a cut of increased revenue. So I said, look, if I take over and I start bringing people in and we sell more and the revenue goes up, you could have a percentage of that, and then who knows what you could take as your total value. Wasn't interested. And ultimately he would, that's fine, I actually really like the guy and his advisor. I'm quite happy to stay in touch with him, but ultimately it didn't work for him, and I was really quite disappointed with that, because I'd put a lot of time, effort and thought into it. But that's a typical deal structure, that is how deals work these days. 90% of deals are structured in a similar way to that. Now, seller finance comes in here because seller finance is about where the seller retains an interest in the business and essentially helps to finance the acquisition. Now, it's a bit of a strange concept. Some people say, well, you're buying a business you're buying it and you're not paying for it until over time. But it's a bit like buying a car. So the car dealerships know that people aren't walking around going into their showrooms with 60, 70, 80,000 pounds in their pocket and just dropping it on a nice BMW or whatever it is. They know that people can get a small amount of money relative to the purchase, and then they finance the rest. And that's just the same way businesses are bought as well. Now, when you're a seller, why would you think about seller finance? Well, it depends on the seller's motivations. If they're just sitting there waiting for someone to come along and write them a big check, then they won't be interested in seller finance. And that's fine, that's their prerogative. But if you've got sellers that are actually keen to exit, then they may want to go along with some seller finance because they get to sell their business. And then they could also put the other kind of hat on, if you like, as an investor. So a lot of these people, the size of businesses that I'm looking at, a lot of the owners have already made plenty of money and they're quite happy with their life, and another, 100 grand or another 500 grand, it doesn't matter whether it lands in the bank today or if it's spread out over 5 years, because it's not going to change their life. They've already made decent money. So what are they going to do with it after they've sold? Well, a lot of them will put it in the stock market or something and see it go up and down and all around. Whereas if you kind of position it as an investment, they're investing in your acquisition, you can then say, or if they're switched on, they could say, well, I'd like a decent interest rate. So the bank might give me 4% at the minute. Why don't you give me 8% on whatever money's owed, and then as you pay it off over time? So effectively, they're kind of, the seller is the mortgage, if you like. And this happens all the time. This is normal business buying practice. The trouble is that a lot of businesses that go through brokers, they're not prepared in this way. Now, you'd think that the broker would be more kind of interested in selling it, but they're not. They're more interested in getting the next one listed. Whereas if they actually looked for businesses that could be sold in this way, and prepared the owners properly and with more realism, then they might actually get both sides of the cake. They might get the first side where they get the commission, and the second side where they actually get something from the sale too. But it seems that whole balance is a bit skewed at the minute. The other thing about seller finance is that a lot of sellers, when you do come to discuss things like this with them, they want their money, they want as much money up front as they can, and they want the rest paid off as quickly as they can. Now, if you have a mortgage, and if the bank want you to pay your mortgage within 3 years instead of 25 years, then it's going to be very, very difficult, and you'll very quickly run into trouble. And the same applies to seller finance. So when you're undertaking a discussion about seller finance, you want to be having realistic timeframes, because out of the profit that the business makes, you've also got to pay for yourself and your time and effort to get the business going and in the direction you want it to. You've also got to service any debts that the business might have, and you may have raised a loan to come up with some of the upfront money, and you may need to pay that. You may have got a mortgage on the property that needs paying that the business operates out of, and then you've got to pay the seller their seller finance payment too. So if the term of the seller finance is really short, where's that money coming from? It's going to stress the cash flow massively, and it's going to make things really tricky. So you've got to be very conscious of the term, and if the seller is kind of very keen to see their business succeed, they may be open to a discussion about a decent period of time, say 4 or 5 years, to get paid out. In fact, I know of one deal where somebody bought an accountancy practice, and the accountant said, yeah, so I want £1 million for it, but I'm well aware of how this works because I've sold several businesses from my clients. I'll just take it over 25 years. I mean, that's what kind of foresight that is. And also it's somebody that just wants their business to carry on and succeed and have an interest in the person taking it over. That's perfect. I've never heard of another one like it, but that would be the ultimate in seller finance, I suspect. But you can do similar things in property too. So in property, there are creative things that I've done myself, such as exchange with delayed completion, where you exchange contracts and then you do the work on the property before you actually pay for it, in that space between exchange of contracts and completion. And then before you get to completion, because you've increased the value of the property, you then get a bridging loan at the higher value, which pays off the initial purchase, and then you put that onto a mortgage. So that's not seller finance, that's just a creative way of doing it. But that kind of mindset from the seller, that they're willing to let you do something like that, is what it takes with seller finance in business. There is a type of seller finance in property. There's like a completion with delayed consideration, where you actually exchange and complete, and then the consideration, which is the payment, gets spread out over a period of time, whether it's in chunks every 3 months, whether it's every month, whether it's every year, whatever it is. And then there's other ways where the seller is actually the mortgage. So they act as the mortgage. You give them an interest. So it might be £100,000 house. You might put £10,000 down, and the seller effectively loans you £90,000 to buy it, and then you pay that £90,000 off over a period of time. So the seller finance does work in property too, but it's not very common. People tend to not kind of understand this kind of creative financing things. You'll find that commercial property owners are more open to it because they've been in business and they know that this kind of commercial way of doing things is really common on the business side. But when it comes over to the residential type stuff, I mean, it does happen, but it's not as common. And I think that kind of sums it up really, where we're up to. So for me personally, I've kind of got one that I'm waiting to find out on heads. I've also just sent out another kind of 1,000 letters or so in the last week or two, and I've had some interesting conversations again. So I'm just waiting. It's a numbers game. It's a matter of getting to know people and waiting for the right thing to arrive. However, if you're watching this and you have a business and you kind of can see that, or if you're listening to it and you can see that I'm trying to do things in a fully open and upfront way, and you'd like to deal with someone like myself, then send me a message. As long as your business is profitable and it can operate without you, then I'd be very interested to have a discussion about acquiring it, irrespective of the sector. if it links in with property somehow, or if the business has a property that it owns and trades from, even better. But for now, thank you very much for watching and listening. I'll be back with you again shortly with another interview, but that's a little update from me so far. All the best, and thanks for your time.